The year is 1775. Imagine standing on the docks of Boston Harbor. The salt air is thick with the smell of tar and gunpowder. Before you lies the most terrifying instrument of power the world has ever known: the British Army. These are the men who tamed the Highlands of Scotland, who humbled the French Bourbons, and who are currently carving out an empire on which the sun never sets. To the casual observer, the conflict brewing in these 13 colonies seems like a foregone conclusion. It is a mathematical impossibility that a ragtag collection of farmers, merchants, and smugglers could stand against the disciplined volley fire of the king's regulars. But we are here to uncover a different story. This is not the story of heroic charges or glorious victories. This is a forensic examination of a catastrophe. We are going to peel back the layers of history to reveal how the greatest military machine of the 18th century was slowly, methodically dismantled. Not by a superior force, but by an idea it could not shoot, and a style of warfare it refused to understand. Welcome to the true story of the American Revolution. But look closer. This wasn't just a war for independence. From the perspective of London, this was something far more complex and dangerous. It was a counterinsurgency. It was a police action gone horribly wrong. The British High Command wasn't just fighting an army, they were fighting a ghost. They were attempting to suppress a rebellion across a landmass roughly 5 times the size of Great Britain, with a logistical tether stretching 3,000 miles across a hostile ocean. To understand why the Redcoats faltered, we must first step inside the mind of a British officer. He is a man of the Enlightenment. He believes in order, hierarchy, and the rules of civilized warfare. In his world, wars are decided by professional armies meeting on open fields. You maneuver, you flank, you unleash a wall of lead, and you seize the enemy's capital. When the capital falls, the war ends. That is the formula. It had worked in Europe for 100 years, but America is not Europe. As we look at the strategic maps of the time, we see the first fatal error. The British government viewed the unrest in Massachusetts not as a widespread popular movement, but as the work of a few radical demagogues. They believed that the vast majority of colonists were loyal subjects held hostage by a vocal minority. If they could just crush the ringleaders and show the flag, the silent majority would rise up and restore order. This was the blind spot. They were looking for a military solution to a political problem. Consider the initial skirmishes. When General Gage sends his troops to Concord to seize gunpowder, he isn't marching to war. He is conducting a police raid. He expects submission. Instead, he finds a hornet's nest. As the British column retreats back to Boston, they are not fighting a conventional enemy. They are being bled white by invisible assailants hidden behind stone walls, trees, and barns. This is the skulking way of war, a terrifying hybrid of frontier survival skills and irregular tactics that the British officer class dismisses as cowardly. This is where our journey begins. We are going to trace the evolution of British strategy from this initial shock to the desperate, scorched earth campaigns of the South. We will see how generals like Howe and Cornwallis tried to adapt. We will witness their attempts to win hearts and minds while simultaneously burning towns. We will explore the paradox of an army that could win every battle and yet lose the war. The tragedy of the British effort lies in its arrogance. They brought a sledgehammer to kill a swarm of mosquitoes. As we delve deeper into this conflict, keep one question in mind. How do you defeat an enemy that is everywhere and nowhere? How do you conquer a people who have already decided they are free? The answer lies not in the history books of victories, but in the forgotten reports of frustrated commanders who realized, too late, that they were fighting the wrong war. As the smoke cleared from the disasters of Lexington and Concord, the British Empire did what empires do. It escalated. By the summer of 1776, the harbour of New York City was filled with a forest of masts. It was the largest expeditionary force Great Britain had ever assembled. At the helm of this armada was General William Howe. To the terrified residents of New York, Howe looked like the angel of death. He commanded 32,000 professional soldiers and Hessians, a force that outnumbered the entire population of Philadelphia. But General Howe is an enigma. As we analyze his command decisions, we find a curious hesitation. Howe was a contradiction in a red coat. He was a Whig who had publicly sympathized with the colonial grievances before the war. Now, he found himself charged with crushing the very people he had defended in Parliament. He carried two commissions in his pocket, one as Commander-in-Chief of the Army and the other as a peace commissioner. He was the sword and the olive branch wrapped in one man. This dual mandate created a schizophrenic strategy. Howe's objective wasn't just to destroy George Washington's army, it was to bring the colonies back into the fold as productive, tax-paying subjects. You cannot achieve that by slaughtering them. This political constraint handcuffed his tactical decisions. Time and again, we see Howe maneuvering brilliantly to outflank Washington, at Long Island, at White Plains, at the Brandywine, delivering crushing blows that sent the Continental Army reeling. But then, at the critical moment of pursuit, when he could have ridden down the disorganized rebels and ended the revolution in an afternoon, he stopped. Why? Historians have debated this for centuries. Was it laziness? Was it his fondness for the comforts of city life? Or was it a calculated gamble? Howe believed that a display of overwhelming force would shock the Americans into submission without the need for a bloodbath. He wanted to be the benevolent conqueror who granted amnesty, not the butcher who ruled over a graveyard. But this hesitation was fatal. It allowed the rebellion to survive its infancy. It allowed Washington, the master of the strategic retreat, to keep his army alive to fight another day. This brings us to the second great failure of British strategy during this phase, the obsession with cities. Military doctrine of the 18th century dictated that you capture the enemy's key cities to paralyze their government and economy. The British excelled at this. They took New York, they took Newport. Later, they would take Philadelphia, the rebel capital. In Europe, the fall of a capital meant the end of the war. But America was a different beast. The British commanders failed to grasp the decentralized nature of the colonies. There was no single nerve center. When Howe marched into Philadelphia in 1777, the Continental Congress simply packed up their papers and moved to York. The rebellion didn't die. It just relocated. The British found themselves in a city trap. They could easily occupy the major ports because of their naval supremacy, but their authority ended exactly where their sentries stood. Outside the city limits, the countryside remained firmly in Patriot hands. The British Army was essentially under house arrest in the very cities they had conquered. To venture out for food or firewood was to invite ambush. This fear of the hinterlands was not unfounded. It was a generational trauma. Many senior British officers remembered the catastrophe of General Edward Braddock in 1755 during the French and Indian War. Braddock had marched a professional column deep into the Pennsylvania woods, only to be annihilated by invisible French and indigenous forces. That memory haunted the British command. It paralyzed them. They stuck to the coast, to the open roads, and to the cities, terrified of being swallowed by the vast, hostile American wilderness. So, by 1778, the war in the north had reached a stalemate. The British held the cities, the Americans held the country, and the rebellion was no closer to being crushed than it was on day one. The strategy of the soft touch had failed. The olive branch had been rejected. The empire was bleeding money and patience. It was time for a new approach. The war was about to turn ugly. With the failure of the northern campaigns and the entry of France into the war, London panicked. The conflict was no longer a colonial rebellion. It was a global war. The British Army needed a way to win quickly and cheaply. They turned their eyes to the south. The theory crafted in Whitehall was seductive in its simplicity. Intelligence reports, often overly optimistic, claimed that Georgia and the Carolinas were teeming with silent loyalists. The plan was to shift the theatre of war southward, landing troops to unlock this reservoir of support. The British would march through the south, and behind them, a tidal wave of loyal subjects would rise up, form militias, and restore royal authority. It was a strategy of Americanizing the war. Let the colonists fight the colonists. Enter the new face of British command, Lord Charles Cornwallis. Unlike the hesitant Howe, Cornwallis was aggressive. He was a hunter. But he was walking into a trap of his own making. The Southern strategy was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of the social fabric of the South. By empowering loyalist militias, the British didn't restore order. They uncorked a bottle of ancient grudges. The war in the South rapidly devolved into a vicious civil war. This wasn't professional armies maneuvering on a map. This was neighbour killing neighbour. When the British encouraged loyalists to take up arms, they utilised them to settle old scores against their patriot neighbours. Farms were burned, livestock slaughtered, and families terrorised. The British regulars, far from being the restorers of peace, became accomplices to chaos. Every time a British column moved through a county, they stripped it bare of food and fodder. They were supposed to be liberators, but they ate like locusts. This turned the neutral population, the very people they needed to win over, into ardent rebels. A farmer who didn't care about taxes or representation certainly cared when a dragoon stole his only milk cow. And then there was the terror. To suppress the rising partisan activity, British subordinates employed brutal tactics. The most infamous of these was Bannister Tarleton. Young, dashing, and utterly ruthless, Tarleton became the symbol of British tyranny in the South. At the Battle of Waxhaws, his legion was accused of slaughtering Virginia Continentals who were attempting to surrender. The cry of Tarleton's Quarter, meaning no mercy, swept through the colonies. This backfired spectacularly. Instead of cowing the population into submission, these atrocities radicalized them. Men who had sat on the fence grabbed their muskets. The British had forgotten a cardinal rule of counterinsurgency. Brutality may win a battle, but it creates 10 new enemies for every one you kill. Cornwallis found himself winning victories that felt like defeats. He could smash an American army at Camden, but he couldn't control the ground he stood on. As soon as his main column marched away, the Patriot militias would emerge from the swamps and pine forests to retake the territory and hang the loyalists he had left in charge. He was fighting a hydra. The turning point of this savage internecine conflict came at King's Mountain in 1780. It was a battle fought entirely between Americans, Patriot militia, versus Loyalist militia. The British regulars weren't even there. The utter destruction of the Loyalist force was a death knell for the Southern strategy. It proved that the British could not rely on their proxies to hold the country. Cornwallis was now alone. He was deep in hostile territory, his Loyalist support shattered, his supply lines harassed by partisan bands like those of Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox. Marion was the ghost the British feared most, striking from the marshes, vanishing before a counterattack could be mounted. He made the British feel constantly besieged, even in the open field. Frustrated, angry, and desperate for a decisive engagement, Cornwallis made a fateful decision. He would stop chasing ghosts in the Carolinas and strike at the heart of the rebellion's supply base. He turned his army north toward Virginia. He was marching toward the sea, hoping for support from the Royal Navy. He was marching toward a sleepy tobacco port called Yorktown. To truly understand why the British war machine broke down, we must lift our eyes from the blood-soaked fields of the Carolinas and gaze out at the Atlantic Ocean. The most formidable enemy the British Army faced wasn't George Washington or the Continental Militia. It was geography. The British were fighting at the end of a 3,000-mile logistical tether. In the 18th century, this distance was almost interplanetary. A letter from the Prime Minister in London took 2 sometimes 3 months to reach the British headquarters in New York. A reply took just as long. This created a strategic time lag that was devastating. Commanders on the ground were operating on orders that were often obsolete by the time they arrived. The War Ministry in London was trying to direct a complex counterinsurgency on a completely different continent, effectively trying to repair a delicate watch using a screwdriver 3,000 miles long. But the tyranny of distance was about more than just communication. It was about survival. The British Army in America was a hungry beast. It required tons of food, fodder, ammunition, and equipment every single day. And because the British did not control the interior of the country, they could not rely on local resources to sustain themselves comfortably. Almost everything, from the gunpowder in their muskets to the buttons on their coats, had to be shipped from England. This logistical fragility forced British commanders into a corner. When the ships were delayed by storms or privateers, the army had to eat. This necessity drove them to forage. But foraging in the 18th century was just a polite word for armed robbery. Parties of soldiers were sent out to strip local farms of grain, cattle, and horses. Imagine the optics of this. A British officer rides up to a neutral farmer, a man who perhaps just wants to be left alone, and confiscates his winter wheat and his only plough horse in the name of the king. In that moment, the British Army wasn't suppressing a rebellion, it was recruiting for it. This was the logistical paradox of the war. To physically survive, the army had to take actions that made political victory impossible. Every bushel of stolen corn fed a soldier for a day, but created a patriot for a lifetime. Then there was the environment itself. The North American theatre was vast, wild, and unforgiving. The sheer scale of the land swallowed armies whole. British troops, accustomed to the manicured roads and moderate climate of Europe, were thrust into a world of extremes. They marched through freezing winters and suffocatingly humid summers, and in the heat of the American South, an invisible killer stalked the ranks: disease. For every soldier who died from a patriot bullet, many more were felled by smallpox, dysentery, and malaria. The British regiments were melting away. In the tight, unsanitary confines of 18th century encampments, camp fever spread like wildfire. A regiment might list 500 men on paper, but only have 200 fit for duty. The rest were shivering in hospital tents or buried in shallow, unmarked graves. This attrition hollowed out the British fighting force. It drained their morale. It is hard to maintain the discipline required for counterinsurgency, the restraint, the patience, the vigilance, when you are starving, sick, and thousands of miles from home. The Redcoats were not unfeeling robots. They were exhausted men, pushed to the breaking point by a land that seemed to want them dead. As Cornwallis dragged his tired, sick, and depleted army into Virginia in 1781, he was running on fumes. The logistical nightmare had done its work. The finest army in the world was essentially a ragged, hungry wanderer, desperately looking for a place to rest and refit. They needed the sea. They needed the Royal Navy to reconnect them to the lifeline of the empire. They looked to the Chesapeake Bay as their salvation. They did not know it would be their tomb. By the autumn of 1781, the British strategy in North America had not just failed, it had cannibalized itself. We find ourselves now in Virginia, on the banks of the York River. It is a sleepy tobacco port called Yorktown. Here, Lord Cornwallis has dug in. He has done exactly what a conventional European commander was trained to do when exhausted. He has secured a deep water port, fortified it with earthworks, and is waiting for the Royal Navy to refit his army. In a traditional war against a traditional enemy, this would have been a sound defensive maneuver. But as we have seen throughout this investigation, this was never a traditional war. Cornwallis believes he is safe. He looks out at the Chesapeake Bay and sees the highway to the empire. He assumes that at any moment, the masts of the British fleet will appear on the horizon, bringing food, reinforcements, or an evacuation. He is relying on the one absolute truth that has held the British Empire together for a century. Britannia rules the waves. The Royal Navy is the ultimate insurance policy. No matter how bad the situation gets on land, the Navy can always reset the board. But unknown to Cornwallis, the board is being flipped. We must now look at the failure of British intelligence and high command coordination. It is a masterclass in dysfunction. While Cornwallis is digging trenches in Virginia, his superior officer, Sir Henry Clinton, sits in New York City, paralyzed by paranoia. George Washington, the master of the feint, has spent months convincing Clinton that an attack on Manhattan is imminent. Washington has built fake bake ovens, drawn up false plans, and let them fall into British hands. Clinton is so convinced that he is the target that he hoards his troops in New York. He fails to see the real danger until it is too late. While Clinton stares at empty tents outside New York, a massive multinational noose is tightening around Cornwallis, 300 miles to the south. Washington and his French ally, the Comte de Rochambeau, are executing a breathless, high-stakes march from Rhode Island and New York to Virginia. It is a logistical miracle, moving thousands of men and heavy artillery without the British noticing the shift in gravity. But the real death blow comes from the sea. This is the moment the American war ends and the global war determines the outcome. The French Navy, under Admiral de Grasse, makes a bold decision to leave the Caribbean and sail for the Chesapeake. On September 5th, the unthinkable happens. The British fleet arrives to rescue Cornwallis, but they find the French waiting for them. The Battle of the Chesapeake is not a famous battle in popular culture. It lacks the drama of Trafalgar or the intimacy of Bunker Hill. It is a tactical, clumsy affair of ships lining up and blasting away at rigging. But strategically, it is arguably the most important naval engagement of the 18th century. The British fleet is repulsed. They turn back to New York to repair. The invisible tether that connected Cornwallis to the Empire is severed. Inside the British lines at Yorktown, the mood shifts from confidence to dread. The realization dawns slowly: no one is coming. The finest army in the world is now trapped in a swampy cul-de-sac, pinned against the river by a fleet that isn't theirs, and facing an allied army that outnumbers them 2-1. The siege of Yorktown begins. It is a mathematical grinding down of the British position. The Allies, French engineers and American infantry, dig parallels, moving their heavy siege guns closer and closer with terrifying precision. For the British regulars, who have marched thousands of miles, survived the pox, and fought in the burning sun of the Carolinas, this is the ultimate betrayal. They are not being outfought by better soldiers. They are being crushed by the weight of their own leadership's arrogance. They are trapped not just by French artillery, but by the failure of the British mindset that refused to adapt to the political and geographic reality of the war. By mid-October, the British position is untenable. Their earthworks are crumbling under a ceaseless bombardment. Disease is rampant in the dugouts. Cornwallis, a proud and aggressive commander, is forced to face the humiliation of total surrender. On October 19th, 1781, the guns fall silent. The British army marches out to stack their muskets. It is a surreal scene. The British soldiers, many in tears, some smashing their muskets in frustration, march between two lines of victors. The polished, white-uniformed French on one side, and the ragged, diverse Continental Army on the other. Legend says the British band played a tune called "The World Turned Upside Down." Whether fact or folklore, the title fits. The superpower had been humbled. But as the British flag was lowered, the shockwave didn't just stop in Virginia. It travelled across the Atlantic, crashing into the halls of Westminster with the force of a tsunami. The military trap had closed, but the political fallout was just beginning. If Yorktown was the physical defeat of the British Army, what happened next in London was the psychological collapse of the British Empire. To understand why the war ended, we have to leave the muddy trenches of Virginia and cross the Atlantic to the smoke-filled back rooms of Westminster. News travelled slowly in the age of sail. It wasn't until November 25th, nearly 5 weeks after the surrender, that the official dispatch reached London. The Prime Minister, Lord North, received the news at his residence on Downing Street. His reaction has become legendary. Witnesses say he took the letter as if he had been shot in the chest. He paced the room, waving his arms wildly, crying out again and again, "Oh God, it is all over." Why such a catastrophic reaction? After all, Britain still had 30,000 troops in North America. They still held New York City, Charleston, and Savannah. They still had a navy. Technically, they could have raised another army and continued the fight. But Lord North, a seasoned politician, understood something the generals did not. The political utility of the war had evaporated. For 6 years, the British government had sold this war to the public and to Parliament, based on a specific set of promises. They had promised that the rebellion was the work of a few radicals. They had promised that the silent majority of Americans were loyal and would rise up. They had promised that one more campaign, one more decisive battle, would restore order. Yorktown exposed all of these promises as fantasies. The Southern strategy, which was supposed to be the low-cost solution using loyalist support, had ended in the total capture of a British army. The lie was laid bare. But the collapse of political will wasn't just about disappointment. It was about bankruptcy. We have to look at the ledger. By 1781, the American war had become ruinously expensive. The national debt had ballooned to terrifying levels, and crucially, Britain was no longer just fighting unruly colonists. They were fighting a global world war. France was attacking British possessions in the Caribbean. Spain was besieging Gibraltar. The Dutch were harassing trade routes. There were threats to the East India Company in India. The empire was stretched to its absolute breaking point. The king's advisors had to make a cold, hard calculation. They looked at the map. The 13 colonies were valuable, yes, but were they worth losing Jamaica? Were they worth losing India? Were they worth a French invasion of the British Isles themselves? The answer was no. The opposition in Parliament, men like Charles James Fox and Edmund Burke, who had long argued against the war, suddenly found themselves with the upper hand. They argued a point that is essential to understanding the end of any counterinsurgency. The cost of occupation had exceeded the value of the territory. They pointed out the absurdity of the situation. Even if Britain could somehow miraculously reconquer the colonies, they would have to garrison them forever. They would have to govern a population of 2 million people who hated them, using an army they couldn't afford to pay. It was a mathematical impossibility. In early 1782, the House of Commons did something extraordinary. They voted to end offensive operations in America. It was a vote of no confidence in the entire imperial project in North America. The Warhawks were swept from power. Lord North's government fell, replaced by a ministry dedicated to peace. This is a critical distinction to make. The British military wasn't annihilated. The British government gave up. The will to fight, that intangible but essential element of warfare, had shifted. The British public was tired. They were tired of the casualty lists, tired of the higher taxes on beer and windows, and tired of a war that seemed to have no moral compass. The peace negotiations that followed in Paris were fascinating. The British diplomats, usually so arrogant, were now pragmatic. They realized that their primary goal was no longer to keep America, but to peel America away from France. They offered generous terms, recognition of independence, vast territory all the way to the Mississippi River, in the hopes that the new United States would become a trading partner rather than a permanent enemy. The Treaty of Paris in 1783 was a formality. The war had actually ended in the minds of the British people 2 years earlier, the moment the news from Yorktown arrived. The Empire cut its losses. It was a strategic amputation. They chose to sever the limb to save the body. It was a decision that hurt national pride, but it saved the British Empire from total collapse, allowing it to pivot toward a new future in the East. But for the soldiers who had fought and bled in the American wilderness, it felt like everything they had endured, the hunger, the disease, the terror, had been for nothing. As the dust settles on the Treaty of Paris and the red-coated regiments board their ships for the long voyage home, we are left with the most nagging question of the entire war. How did the economic and military superpower of the 18th century lose to a loose confederation of colonies with no navy, no currency, and a government that barely functioned? To answer this, we must perform a forensic autopsy of the defeat. It is easy to blame incompetent generals or the intervention of the French, but the rot went deeper than that. The British Empire did not lose because of a lack of courage or firepower. They lost because they fell into the conventional warfare trap. The British High Command was educated in the Age of Reason. They viewed war as a game of chess played between gentlemen. You move your pieces, you capture the enemy's capital, you defeat their main army in the field, and the checkmate is inevitable. In Europe, this logic held true. If you took Paris or Vienna, the war ended. But in America, the British captured New York, they captured Philadelphia, they captured Charleston. They won almost every major set-piece battle of the war. Yet, every time they looked at the map, the rebellion had not shrunk, it had grown. They were trying to solve a political problem with a purely military solution. They failed to understand that in an insurgency, the center of gravity is not a city or a fortress. It is the people. This brings us to the most critical failure, the misreading of the American population. General Howe and later Clinton operated under the assumption that the silent majority of Americans were loyal subjects held hostage by a radical minority. They believed their job was simply to liberate these loyalists, but they fundamentally misunderstood the nature of neutrality. Most Americans were not die-hard patriots or fanatical loyalists. They were farmers, shopkeepers, and parents who just wanted security. They wanted to sell their crops and sleep without fear of their house being burned down. The British Army failed to provide this security. When the British moved into an area, they brought inflation, disease, and plunder. When they moved out, they left their loyalist supporters to the mercy of the returning patriot militias. By failing to protect the population, the British proved they could not govern. And if you cannot govern, you cannot win an insurgency. Every time a redcoat stole a chicken or burned a fence for firewood, he wasn't just committing a crime, he was voting for the Continental Congress. The British alienated the very people they needed to win over. Furthermore, the British military machine was structurally incapable of adapting. It was a heavy, slow-moving beast designed to fight on the open plains of Germany. It relied on massive baggage trains and strict linear discipline. Against the American skulking way of war, ambushes, night raids, sniper fire, the British were often helpless. They needed light infantry, they needed speed, and they needed independent decision-making by junior officers. While they made attempts to adapt, creating units like the Queen's Rangers, the institution as a whole remained rigid. They were fighting the last war, the 7 Years' War, while the Americans were inventing the first modern war of national liberation. There is a concept in military theory called the Trinity of War, the balance between the government, the army, and the people. The British strategy severed these links. The government in London set unrealistic goals. The army in America could not execute them. And the people, both in America and eventually in Britain, withdrew their support. The tragedy of the British officer in this war is that he was often a competent professional, tasked with an impossible job. He was asked to conquer a geographic space that was too big, with too few men, while trying to be both a ruthless conqueror and a benevolent peacemaker simultaneously. It was a strategic paradox. The harder they squeezed the colonies, the more the rebellion slipped through their fingers. In the end, the British defeat was a failure of imagination. They could not imagine a world where a professional army could be defeated by a rabble. They could not imagine that a people would endure years of bankruptcy and starvation for an abstract idea like liberty. They underestimated the enemy's will, and in doing so, they ensured their own destruction. We stand now at the end of our journey. It is November 25th, 1783. The location is New York City. The day is crisp and cold. On the docks, the last regiments of the British Army are boarding their transport ships. The war has been over for 2 years on paper, but only now is the physical reality taking place. As the British oars splash into the water, rowing away from the Manhattan shoreline, they leave behind not just a continent, but a shattered worldview. This moment, known as Evacuation Day, marks more than just the birth of the United States. It marks the first time in modern history that a European colonial power was forcibly ejected by its own subjects. As those ships slipped over the horizon, they carried with them 60,000 loyalists, refugees of a lost cause. These were the people who had bet on the empire and lost everything. They would scatter to Canada, the Caribbean, and London, living ghosts of a policy that failed. Their displacement is the forgotten human cost of the British failure to secure the peace. But as we watch the redcoats fade into the mist, we must ask, what was the legacy of this catastrophe for the British military? Surprisingly, it did not break them. In fact, it may have saved them. The shock of defeat forced the British Army to look in the mirror. They realized that the rigid, mechanical tactics of the Frederick the Great era were obsolete in the face of a motivated, irregular enemy. In the decades that followed, we see a transformation. The British Army that would later fight Napoleon was different, more flexible, utilizing light infantry and riflemen, integrating the lessons learned in the forests of North America. They learned that to win a war, you must be able to fight in the woods as well as the open field. Sir John Moore, the father of the British light infantry, cut his teeth as a junior officer in this war. The disaster in America forged the weapon that would eventually liberate Europe from French tyranny. However, the deeper lesson of the American Revolution is one that echoes painfully down the corridors of history, right up to the present day. It is a lesson about the limits of military power. The British Empire in 1775 was the equivalent of a modern superpower. It had the money, the technology, and the professional soldiers. Yet, it was humbled by a ragtag coalition. Why? Because the British forgot that war is not an engineering problem. You cannot simply calculate tonnage and firepower and predict a victory. War is a human endeavor. The British failed because they tried to fight a war of conquest against a people who were fighting a war of survival. They underestimated the resilience of an insurgency that is woven into the fabric of the local population. The American lesson became a warning that future superpowers would often ignore. We see the shadows of General Howe and Lord Cornwallis in the rice paddies of Vietnam and the valleys of Afghanistan. We see the same initial overconfidence, the same reliance on superior technology, the same confusion when the enemy refuses to fight a conventional battle, and the same gradual erosion of political will at home. The Redcoats were the first to learn the hard way that you cannot kill your way out of an insurgency. You cannot occupy a land if you have lost the hearts of the people who live there. As the sun sets on the British Empire in America, we are left with a final irony. The loss of the 13 colonies did not end Britain's rise. Freed from the drain of the American War, the empire pivoted. They turned their eyes east, to India, to Africa, to Australia. The Second British Empire would be larger and wealthier than the first. But the ghost of America would always haunt them, a reminder that even the greatest lion can be brought down if it walks blindly into a den of wolves. The American Revolution was not just the end of a colony, it was the beginning of the modern world. And for the British soldier, standing alone in the vast American wilderness, it was the ultimate lesson in humility. Thank you for joining us on this expedition into the forgotten tactical realities of the American Revolution. It is a story often told from the victor's perspective, but looking at it through the eyes of the British command reveals a tragic, complex, and fascinating failure of strategy. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the strategic paradoxes of the British Empire, please leave a like. It really helps the channel. And I want to hear from you in the comments. Do you think the British ever had a chance to win? Or was the war lost the moment the first shot was fired at Lexington? Don't forget to subscribe to British War History and ring the bell so you don't miss our next documentary. We'll see you in the next video.